Well, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today. I'm sure you've been in high demand since the announcement came earlier this month. So really, really appreciate that.
Well, it's my privilege, and this is such an important thing that everyone ought to know about. So,
Absolutely. Um, Maybe just kind of a quick rundown on my side here. Obviously, like I said, we're recording.
yeah.
I'll be publishing a web story based on our conversation, and hopefully a chat with some other people in the NWT around this as well. And then probably use some clips of our conversation on our morning show, if that's okay with you.
That's just fine.
Fantastic. Yeah, I don't know. It's such a, I guess, do you have, well, I guess before we begin, do you have any questions for me?
No, I think I'm good to go.
Perfect. It's kind of a big, broad topic to tackle, I guess, from the outset. But based on my research and somewhat keeping up with this story over the years, it's been said that you were one of the people that filed the initial complaint that led 15 years later, basically leading to this. But maybe we can start there. Back in 2007, when you filed that initial complaint, maybe just where were you at the time where you felt like you had to go through this process and start this process?
Yeah, well, the story actually begins at least 15 years before that, when I was working in Child and Family Services off reserve and literally crossed the line to work on reserve and saw the dramatic inequalities that these families were having to deal with. Like basic things like trying to get a standing frame for a young child with cerebral palsy that was because his was held together with duct tape and the feds were saying no. The injustice of it, the racism of it, and the fact that they were so banal about it, right? Such as normal business. This was like, how dare you expect that a child would get a standing frame that wasn't held together with duct tape? That fueled me. And so I joined together with others nationally, and we actually worked with the feds. And back then I was so naive. I thought, okay, we're going to document all these inequalities, and then we're going to show them how to fix it. And they're going to do it, because who wouldn't do it? Like when it hurts kids so badly. Did all that, and they did nothing. And we actually then did a second report in 2005, same result. Lots of, we'll review it, we'll take it into consideration. But the problem with that approach is that the number of First Nations kids going into child welfare care while we're sitting around those tables rose about 70%. So that really alarmed us to the fact that we couldn't waste any more time with Canada. It was clear by this time they were going to choose to discriminate, and that it would take at least the courts to get them out of that pattern.
When you mentioned you felt, looking back now, that you felt that you're maybe a little bit naive back then, I guess I'm wondering, now, like I said, 15 years on, did you ever feel, I guess, at that point that we would get to this point? And there's kind of, I guess, two sides to that question. One, in that it was going to take this long, and then two, maybe that there is finally some sort of agreement and acknowledgement on behalf of Canada that this is happening.
I think all the way through it, I actually expected that at some point, someone's going to turn on the light bulb there in Ottawa, realize the harms to these kids. Because the evidence was just piling up during the 15 years of this litigation. And it was coming from credible sources like the Auditor General, First Nations themselves, medical associations, teachers associations, everybody was on board. It was almost like the government was in a QAnon mode, right? Of denial. Oh, no, not us. Don't look over here. Everything is good here. Ribbon cutting. But the harms were happening to kids. I did not expect that it would take 15 years. And by the time the judgment came in 2016, substantiating the racial discrimination again by the Canadian government, and they paraded their ministers out to welcome the hearing, I was suspicious by then that they wouldn't comply. And indeed, that's what's happened. So this whole $40 billion announcement comes only after 21 non-compliance and procedure orders against the government and several failed appeals at the federal court. And of course, public pressure and pressure by First Nations themselves. That's the only way we got here. It was literally dragging them kicking and screaming.
Yeah, fair enough. I want to get into the agreement in principle that was announced, but maybe just one more personal question for yourself. You said, you've been working on this for a long, long time. Maybe just yeah, share what brought you to do this work. How did you come into doing this and kind of making this your life's work?
Well, I just really believe I'm in love with kids for one thing. And I think injustices to me towards children by adults, by powerful adults in government, especially on the heels of residential schools.
Mm-hmm.
That was something that it was so horrible. Like I saw these wonderful children in these families who wanted to raise them and just weren't being given the same chance and were giving all this trauma. And to be honest, when I first noticed it, I was convinced that someone had to do something. And second of all, that I wasn't that person, that there had to be somebody else out there to do it, right? Someone who knows more, someone who's good, who's better at this stuff. I think a lot of us felt that way when we see these inequalities. We're kind of waiting around for someone to show up. But eventually, I think if you push yourself over that line, you start to realize that there's a lot of people working on it. And the injustice of it becomes even more clear. And the fact is that you have to stay there. You have to stand in the winds of this discrimination. Because if you leave, it means that the children are standing there alone and the families are there alone. So it's our job, I think, those of us who have been kind of privileged in life, to really take the hit as much as we can and never give up on those kids and those families.
You mentioned, pushing yourself across the line there. I'm curious, is there anything specific that comes to mind that really ended up being kind of that catalyst for you to be able to say, maybe I am this person to take on this fight? Because I can imagine that before, I guess, being willing to take that step, that fight, it must be one of the most daunting things you've faced.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And what was so scary is that, I had never done anything like this before. I was a social worker. I just wanted to be there working with families. I considered it a great privilege. And to kind of have to do policy work and take on the government and do litigation, like that was totally new territory for me. But I really felt compelled to do it. And I also want to say that I really felt this case was spiritually guided. I know that might sound kind of odd to some of your listeners, but I really feel that there were times during this whole process when I was about to screw up and make a bad decision, or that we needed more resources, or we needed a better idea. And it always came along. I just really feel that all those children who were lost in residential schools, the survivors from residential schools, the 60 Scoop survivors, and children like Jordan River Anderson, the founder of Jordan's Principle, that they were up there guiding us along all the way through this. And you can't say no to them.
I guess to get into the agreement itself that was announced, $40 billion, large sum of money. And then that's from what I've seen, 50%, I guess about half or so, is going towards compensation, and the other half is going towards systemic reform. I guess before we get into the deep details, you've said, since this announcement, that these are basically nice words on paper. Yeah. I'm wondering if you can expand on that a little bit.
Sure. Well, all this is a non-binding agreement. Nothing changed for children the day that document was signed. And that's how I measure change. It's, are we seeing families getting the types of supports they need to recover from the trauma of residential schools? Have things changed for them there? Are young people in care getting the supports that they need to be able to transition to young adulthood? Has the government fixed itself so it will not hurt another generation of First Nations kids because it's a repeat offender? None of that stuff has happened. The words are on paper there, but it hasn't landed. And when we step back and we look at Canada's relationship to First Nations, be it in self-government agreements, be it in treaties, be it in healthcare agreements, they put a lot of nice words on paper. It's landing those words on paper so they make a positive difference in the lives of community members. That's always where they fall short. So I'm going to be celebrating when we actually land this for the kids and when we end the inequalities that are not covered by this agreement. So things like water, housing, those kinds of things are still out there and they need to be addressed.
Yeah, you mentioned, I guess, other examples of maybe the Canadian government saying, yes, we're going to commit, I guess, to working with Indigenous people across the country. This summer, there were quite a few celebrations, not celebrations. I take that back. Commemorations of the centennial of Treaty 11 up here in the Northwest Territories that was signed in 1921. So I got to travel to a few communities, and it was interesting how that message was basically the same in every community. That yes, there was this agreement, but the Canadian government did not uphold their end of the bargain. I'm wondering, we hear this from 100 years ago now, and you've dealt with something similar today. I guess what kind of reaction does that bring up in you?
Well, that really just reinforces to me that the reform that we really need is within the Canadian government. You know what? When we look back until 1922, there's a guy named Peter Henderson Bryce, Canada's first health inspector. And he was the guy that sounded the alarm about the needless deaths of kids in residential schools, tying it back to Canada's deplorable levels of healthcare funding for kids in the schools and their terrible health practices. He was lamenting the fact that these kids could be saved. He actually says back then, as early as 1907, again in 1922, that the whole matter of the government's treatment of, quote, Indians needs to be ventilated, i.e. there needs to be an inquiry. No one has ever taken a good look behind that curtain to figure out why is it that they choose always to not do better when they know better across a whole array of things, from land, water, healthcare, education, you name it. It feels like we're in this pattern where we're putting towards evidence and solutions from communities, and they're just bouncing back at us, and we're doing more evidence and more solutions, and it's bouncing back at us. We have to break that pattern.
In going through this process, through the courts since the complaint with the Human Rights Tribunal, did anyone ever come to you and, I don't want to say try and justify, but explain why there was systemic underfunding and on-reserve child welfare systems? Did anyone actually try and break it down as to why this was, why this was justified, as opposed to just an egregious oversight on the government's behalf?
You know what? On the government side, the answer to that is no.
Yeah.
They actually, what they would come to me for is to ask why I wasn't grateful for all the good things that they've already done. We've done more than any other government. This is a good first step. Yes, there's more work to do, but this is a good first step. Why aren't you satisfied with this? You'll never be satisfied. You're always looking for perfection. That's what I heard. And I also, frankly, even on sometimes we get from messages from people saying, this is never going to work. What you're doing is never going to fix the inequalities. You should sit at the negotiating table with Canada. I said, well, we already tried that. It didn't work.
Yeah.
But there was all these things that were happening, but no one on the government side and none of their legal arguments ever went to the place of what we're doing as a government is actually better for kids. They never wanted to argue this case on that basis because they knew that they were dead in the water. The evidence was against them. Instead, they tried to make this about being the tribunal jurisdiction being inappropriate or overreaching. And what those arguments really amounted to is that the federal government was the victim and it shouldn't be accountable under its own laws. That's really what those arguments were all about.
Mm-hmm. To dig into the agreement in principle a little bit, like I mentioned earlier, about half of that is going for compensation. Yeah. There's a lot, I think, included in that because there's, of course, the on-reserve child welfare system, which also includes the Yukon. But then there's also this element around Jordan's principle that has been included, I guess, in this agreement in principle. Can you maybe help explain what that looks like, having both of these come together?
Right. Well, the original complaint included Jordan's principle, which is really about ensuring First Nations children have access to public services when they need them in ways that are free of discrimination. So it was that, and it was also this on-reserve child welfare stuff in the Yukon. That together was the complaint. So over the years, as you might know, in Parliament in 2007, the Parliament adopted Jordan's principle. Mm-hmm. So that should have been the end of it, right? If they would have implemented it. But they didn't. And they fought Jordan's principle. In fact, if you look back at the parliamentary records, you're going to find minister after minister like Valcourt and others rising up and saying, there are no Jordan's principle cases out there. And I said, are you kidding me? I said, every time I go to a community, parents and family members are coming up and saying, look, my child's being denied services, even though other kids get them. So the tribunal's decision in 2016 said that Canada's failure to implement Jordan's principle was racially discriminatory and ordered them to stop. And Canada did not. And so it took us another few years of non-compliance orders. And tragically, in the meantime, children were suffered. At least 3 children's deaths are linked to Canada's non-compliance. But that's why the tribunal said that compensation is owed to the children who are denied those services under Jordan's principle and their families who experienced unreasonable delay. That's not everybody, but it's a significant number of people. And then as well, the children who were removed because their families were denied services and those caregivers as well. Again, not everybody, but many people. We're talking about, on the Child and Family Service side, probably close to 60,000 kids. Think about that. That's bigger than the population of Fredericton, New Brunswick.
That's more people than in the entire Northwest Territories.
Yeah,
and
that's
then
right.
some. Yeah,
like that just gives you a real sense of the human tragedy of this. And when I step back and I think, back in 2000, when I was so naive, it would have been hundreds of millions of dollars to fix this. There would have been no $20 billion payable for compensation because there would have been no victims. And I just think for government, like, they have to learn from this, right? We can't afford to lose so many children's childhoods, families, unbelievable trauma, and children's lives because the government can't get its act together to do the right thing.
So the majority of our listeners here are in an interesting situation in that the Northwest Territories, based on my understanding, is excluded from the agreement in principle because the Child and Family Services system here, basically some of the money is coming from the federal government, but it's being rerouted through the territorial government, and then they end up making the decision around where that money is going. A different funding model, essentially. So I guess I'm wondering, a broader one for you. Do you know maybe some of the background around that history of why the system in the Northwest Territories and Nunavut is funded differently than the Yukon and the rest of Canada?
Right. I don't know all the history. I know that when this discriminatory funding approach, the one that gives rise to the tribunal's decision and compensation, when that was developed as early as 1989, there was already in place this very different funding arrangement in the NWT. So this dates back decades. And it had to do, the way the government would explain it to us is it had to do with the self-government agreements that were signed with the First Nations up there.
Oh, interesting.
However, Jordan's principle does apply in the NWT. So all those orders regarding Jordan's principle are applying there. And there is a table that's being set up with nations in the NWT, as I understand it in Canada, to be able to address some of the serious and real needs in the NWT. And I think that, my own view is it should be, these orders that we've gotten through the tribunal should be the floor of what people in the Northwest Territory get, right? And you should be able to tailor that to your distinct community needs and circumstances up in the NWT. So I don't think that there's any ethical or even logical argument that Canada can mount to say that those children should be left behind. I think that would be terribly, terribly wrong.
I was going to ask this later, but it kind of stems from this question. We've had 2 Auditor General reports look at the Child and Family Services system in the territory. First one being in 2014, the other one in 2018. Both of them, you often hear the scathing report, but these really were scathing in the sense of, things just got worse between the 2 reports. And that was ultimately the Auditor General's finding in 2018. Now, I guess despite the territory being in charge of the Child and Family Services system, do you think that this agreement in principle should maybe give the territorial government pause and thought, time to think about maybe they have maybe they can prevent something like this happening up here? Is that something that, I guess what do you think about that?
Absolutely. I think that they should be seriously thinking about that. And the other thing is that back in about 2009, I want to think, I had the honor and privilege of traveling all over the Northwest Territories as part of that legislative review. And what really struck me is that, it was many of the same challenges, like lack
Mm.
of housing. It was poverty. It was the multi-generational trauma from residential schools. It was lack of addiction support because the trauma wasn't dealt with. So people were turning to addictions. It was all those things that were so familiar to me in my other work across the country. That was driving the overrepresentation. And then there was a lack of support for local at a community level for people to actually be able to address these challenges for families that are in crisis. And often the kids were being removed, but they're being sent down to Yellowknife or indeed even further south than that, and really perpetuating that dislocation. Throughout those conversations, however, what I heard time and time again are really practical solutions from community members.
Fair enough. Yeah.
I always think, like, why isn't anybody listening to these people? They actually, they got on the ground experience. And so I don't know how that report was received by community members back then, but I can only say, to me, what was really clear is that there are very clear practical things that can be done to support communities and to support families in the NWT, and they ought to be done.
Fair enough. To talk, I guess, of this other half of the compensation, the other half of the agreement in principle, this about $20 billion going for systemic reform. That's I guess, wishy-washy term at the best of times. And it says this 20 billion is over 5 years. Yeah. Do you know if this is the next 5 years, or is this a 5-year period with an undetermined start time? Yeah.
Well, I think that the idea is over the next 5 years, but my question is what happens in year 6? I'm not interested in non-discrimination for 5 years and then see everything roll back. I mean, we haven't come this far to just give them their photo op and then go back to business as usual. I think that this has really got to be a chance where we really significantly implement those community-based solutions. I've always really felt strongly that the best solutions are from people who are in those communities. Sometimes they need support from, others around them. They might need funding support, that kind of stuff. That stuff that is all solvable, but empower the people on the ground to do their work with their children. I really feel strongly about that. And so that's the type of approach I want to see go forward. The other is I really want to make sure that we're acting on the basis of evidence. So we already know what the drivers are of kids going into care. So let's make sure that when we talk about prevention, that we're actually dealing with those problems. Because one of the issues with child welfare is that it codifies what I view as systemic discrimination by governments as a parental deficit. So let's say if you're in a community where there's no water, there's inadequate housing, where your child hasn't been given the same types of supports, and that you're dealing with trauma. Often what child welfare will do is, with the acts, the way they're constructed, is they'll say, well, you're neglecting your child. Well, when the real thing is that you actually would be way better off if you had clean water to drink and all these other things. I think that's the problem. And I think when people say child welfare is broken, I'm not sure I agree with that entirely. I think that it's the fact that we expect so much out of child welfare. It's like policing, the same drivers. If we don't address these underlying problems, then we're going to see more persons incarcerated. Well, that same issue plays out in child welfare, plays out in mental health issues. We have to get serious at dealing with the source of the problem.
I guess with that being said, we have this money that's been set aside now. My understanding is the agreement has not been signed. We just have this in principle element to it. So there's still some details to be hashed out. But, assuming we have this money, how do you address those drivers that end up having kids and ending up in the child welfare system? I guess how broad is the scope that this money can be used for? Because, you've mentioned anything from housing to water that can include education. It's just so all encompassing. So where do you go from there? What is the first step?
Well, for me, there's a couple of things. One is you're exactly right. This is when you talk about child welfare, we need to think of it differently. We need to think of it as housing. We need to think of it as multi-generational trauma. That is child welfare, not a narrow kind of parenting course kind of approach. We need to implement something called the Spirit Bear Plan. And what that was is from 2017, approved by the Chiefs Assembly, it was cost out all these gaps in services that First Nations families experience and create something like the Marshall Plan after the Second World War. Remember where they rebuilt Europe within, a decade? Well, if they can rebuild Europe, they can actually provide equitable and culturally based supports to kids. I mean, it's not that hard. They already do it for every other kid in the country. So they've got that part figured out. Let's get that stuff in place. Because if we dealt with that, then with the services like child welfare, the services like policing, etc., we'd only be dealing with the most crisis cases. We'd actually be giving families a fair chance to grow up in a way that they feel proud culturally and they feel safe, and all the rest of that would happen because we dealt with that. So we need to get that Spirit Bear plan, and we need to advocate for that. And then the other thing is we need to rethink how we're going to use those monies in the meantime. I agree with you. I actually want to see some of this money actually going to housing. I want to see some of this money going to poverty alleviation. I want to see some of this money going to family-based addiction services, because that's the kind of thing that would make a huge difference.
Simple question, but are you confident that's going to happen?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I guess I don't want to be that naive person I was 20 years ago. I still want to believe in the possible. I think, the option is becoming a pessimist and saying nothing's going to happen. I can just say that I'm going to push as hard as I can to do that. And I think all of us need to push so that we have people around that table who are actually experts in the field. And by that, I mean people who have been doing the work with children and families should be really leading the way in these negotiations. Because we need to have those practical on the ground solutions come out this that really would make a difference for families. And sometimes, you can sit down here in Ottawa and you can think, oh, that sounds good. And then you get it up there to somewhere like Yellowknife and maybe not, that doesn't work so well. Right?
For sure.
And that's why the ground up approach is so important.
Just a couple more here for you. You've mentioned in another interview, basically, these are nice words on paper, but people have to keep the pressure on government to make sure that they do follow through with this, that there is the implementation aspect that you're waiting to see as well. So as someone who, isn't in your position, you're at the heart of this, but for someone who's up in some of our small communities here, what thing can they do to keep that pressure on?
Well, one of them is, of course, is to talk to their leadership in their community to say, look, we heard about this Spirit Bear plan and all the inequalities. Let's get on board with that. Let's make sure that our children and families, we benefit from the same kind of services as a minimum standard that everybody else in the country is, and we don't get left behind. Let's make sure that when we're thinking about child welfare, that we're thinking about it in those broad places. And then also write to the folks in the territory and say, hey, this is happening to us too. And you have the solutions on the books. You have those Auditor General reports that should have been a wake-up call. So you need to change things for kids. And why you need to change it is because that the hurt is happening. And you also have the power to make a huge difference in their lives for the positive and stop it. And if not, then take them to court. That's always my view. I always get, now if I was to redo the tape, it would be, okay, government, here's the solution. You have 6 months to implement this. If you don't, then we're going to file a complaint and force that change. The option we can't leave them to set the timetable for kids anymore. I think that's really clear. We need to do that. We need to have that litigation. We need to have that groundswell from the community members demanding that this is the last generation of First Nations kids that have to recover from their childhoods or dream about getting a clean glass of water. I want First Nations kids to dream, but about other stuff, not just getting the basics that every other kid in the country gets.
Yeah, fair enough. This is a bit of a side question, but we've heard there has been movement on legislation that would allow Indigenous communities to take on child and family services basically under their own jurisdiction. So how does that play with what has happened here and this agreement in principle kind of moving forward now? The reason I ask is because we've seen the Inuvialuit come in the territory kind of take this on and start pushing for their own in-house policy around child and family services.
I've I would say a couple things. Again, it's no surprise, I really support community-based laws and all the rest of it. I am worried about this one though, and I'll tell you why. Because the way that they crafted this law was very child welfare based in the traditional way we understand child welfare, not what we've been talking about getting at housing, getting at trauma, getting at addictions, getting at domestic violence. That is in there to some degree, but not in a serious way. And when I've had the privilege of talking to First Nations about their traditional laws were, often they're clan laws or family laws that would include things like education, et cetera. This is a straight up child welfare intervention. So it's already very narrowing. The other piece is the feds take the position that they don't have to, the CHRT orders do not apply to them if they fund a First Nation. So all of these hard fought wins that we've all collectively got, well, those are on the side. We're going to negotiate straight up with you on a funding agreement. And what we've seen in the early stages of their rollout is they're replicating a lot of their discriminatory behaviors again. And so we find ourselves in a position where you can take self-determination, although narrowed, fenced in by what the feds feel the appropriate child welfare law is. And then you will get a funding regime that the feds probably should know that already will, in a few years' time, not work. Or you stay with the provincial territorial jurisdiction and you get more funding. That devil's bargain shouldn't be happening. We should be empowering, recognizing First Nations jurisdiction and providing the adequate supports to be able to get there.
Last thing, again, has been mentioned multiple times here, this is just an agreement in principle. There's still negotiations that are happening. There's expected to be a, I guess, official agreement signed later this year is my understanding, or at least hoping that's the timeline. But maybe can you kind of talk about what these next steps are? There's until March 31st, and then on April 1st, there's supposed to be some additional funding for, I guess, kids known as like aging out of the system. That's supposed to be coming in, but then it sounds even broader than that, you know, once that happens.
Yeah, and there will be additional prevention funding provided on child and family services that day. But you're quite right. The negotiations on the rest of it are going to take months after that. I'm one of the rare, I'm not a politician, so I'm not gunning for a date. I'm gunning for an outcome. You know, I think that we've been at this 154 years in this country where the government has treated our kids as if they're not worth the money. And I want to make sure that we've done the work of going out and talking to communities and really making sure that whatever we agree to really is informed and supports what their plans are for their kids. We're in the middle of a pandemic. So I know the feds would like to say, oop, let's get this tribunal behind us, right? And, you know, it has been a long, really resource intensive process. But to me, the end date should only be set when children and families and communities say, you know what, okay, this does the bit for us. This helps move the yardstick forward so our families can be healthy and proud. So others are rushing towards a date at the end of the year. I'm rushing towards the communities to really set the pace of what that looks like.
Fair enough. I think that's it for myself, unless there's anything else that you would like to add.
No, that was great. Thank you very much.